All right. Well, hello everyone and welcome. Let me get my windows lined up right so that I can talk to you and see you. Um, so, okay, I think I'm there. So hello and welcome. My name is Alison Arant. I'm an English instructor at Metropolitan Community College in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm also one of the organizers of the Richard Wright Society. I want to welcome you warmly to today's event. It's a cold day in Omaha, Nebraska. I don't know if it's cold where you are, but we are just coming to the end of a week that was so cold that no one had any school or anything happening for weeks, or it feels like it's been weeks. It really was like a full week. So we all have cabin fever. So I'm pleased to be out and talking to people, even on Zoom. It feels exciting. So welcome to today's event. We'll be hearing from contributors to the recently published edited collection, Faulkner, Welty, Wright, A Mississippi Confluence, which came out in June of 2024 from the University of Mississippi Press. In a moment, I'll introduce my friend and fellow Wright organizer, Dr. Almas of the University of Mississippi, and she'll introduce our conversation today. But before we do that, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent death of an important figure in Richard Wright's studies. Today, I'd like to honor the life and memory of Dr. Jerry Ward, who passed away on the 8th of February this year. And I see I'm sorry to be the one perhaps delivering that news to maybe some of you who knew him. So, but no doubt if you've worked on Wright studies, his name is familiar to you. In case you aren't familiar, I'll just mention a little bit about his notable and illustrious background. Dr. Ward was a renowned poet, essayist, literary critic, and Richard Wright scholar. He joined the faculty of Dillard University in 2002 and served as a distinguished professor of English and Africana Studies until his retirement in 2012. His passion for literature and commitment to academic excellence and vast contributions to African American literary scholarship left an indelible mark on the Dillard community, but also on the international community of Wright readers and scholars. Born in Washington, D.C., and raised in Mississippi, Dr. Ward's academic journey was one of brilliance and dedication. He earned his B.S. in mathematics from Tougaloo College and his M.S. from the Illinois Institute of Technology and his Ph.D. in English from the University of Virginia. Before arriving at Dillard, he spent over 3 decades at Tougaloo College, where he shaped the academic landscape as an English professor and department chair. Beyond the classroom, Dr. Ward was a leader in the literary and civil rights communities, serving in several key roles with the Modern Language Association, the Mississippi Humanities Council, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission's Mississippi Advisory Committee. His scholarship, particularly on Wright and African American literature, earned him numerous accolades, including the Darwin T. Turner Award of Excellence and the Public Humanities Scholar Award and the Richard Wright Literary Excellence Award. He was a co-founder of Callaloo and a charter member of the Richard Wright Circle, the organization that preceded our current incarnation as the Richard Wright Society. So in many ways, we stand on his shoulders. And today I wanted to take a moment to honor his life and work. The Mississippi writer C. Lee McInnes, just to add to our confluence today, has written a really lovely tribute to him. I'll put the link in the chat so that if you'd like, you can read that, maybe learn more about his work, or just join in spaces for honoring his memory. So we did want to begin by sharing that news. Hopefully that link comes through for everyone. And just honoring Dr. Jerry Ward for a beautiful life of contributions in many ways to the study of literature and to Richard Wright studies in particular. So I wanted to share that with you. And now I'll take the opportunity to introduce Almas Khan, who will be introducing our conversation today. So thank you, Almas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on this fabulous new edited collection, Faulkner, Welty, Wright, and Mississippi Confluence, out from the University of Mississippi Press, which is my home institution. I am actually an assistant professor of law at the University of Mississippi. I have a PhD in English, and I write very broadly in law and literature, intellectual history, and critical race theory. And I'm delighted to be here to facilitate this conversation. So we are here to hear from contributors to this excellent anthology, which I think is going to be an important intervention in both American literary studies as well as Southern studies. And we're joined today by one of the book's co-editors, my colleague in the English department, Professor Annette Trefzer, and several contributors to the collection. It has been it's actually inspired or adapted from presentations at the 2021 47th annual Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha, and of course I'm mispronouncing, even though I heard Faulkner pronounce it right before this talk. Conference. With that said, I'll just say a little bit about logistics. Professor Trefzer is going to tell us a little bit more about the collection and the contributors, and then each of the contributors is going to distill their essays for us in about 5 minutes. And after that, we will open the floor for a virtual conversation amongst the participants, including both the contributors and the audience. So that said, I will turn the floor over to Professor Trefzer, and I look forward to our dialogue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Almas and Alison. We're really excited to have this conversation. As I've mentioned a second ago, it's lovely for Welty and Faulkner scholars to build bridges over into Richard Wright scholarship. And I'd mentioned how difficult it was initially when we planned the conference, the 2021 conference on Faulkner, Welty, Wright, to get in touch with Wright scholars. And we're certainly missing Jerry Ward in our round today, as well as John Wharton Lowe, who's also written on Richard Wright and is no longer with us. So I just wanted to just to say that. Yeah, so we have for Faulkner, Welty, Wright, a Mississippi Confluence, 12 contributors to the volume. And when we first sort of started talking about, that is Jay Watson and I, we started talking about a conference, we wanted to highlight Mississippi writers who were writing approximately at the same time. And so, of course, this being the Faulkner Conference, Faulkner was our anchor, and we brought him into conversation with Eudora Welty and also Richard Wright. When we looked for a cover for the book, I was like, wait a second, isn't there a statue in Jackson, Mississippi that is of all three writers? And it is by Rod Moorhead. It is a larger-than-life stone-hewn statue of the three writers. And what I found really interesting when I saw the statue for the first time is that the three writers are depicted in close physical proximity to each other, but they are turned with their backs towards each other, each facing out into a different direction. So I thought that was a perfect and interesting sort of metaphor for a shared physical space and for the different kinds of perspectives that each writer offers. So when you stand in front of the statue, and if you have not been there, please do. It's in downtown Jackson, not very far from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. You can always only face one writer at the time, and the other two writers would be turned with their back towards the viewer. And so it is here sort of that we wanted to begin with these different kind of vantage points in the shared geographical space. And the other thing that sort of like, in terms of sort of like spacing the writers in the same geographical space, Richard Wright was born in Roxy, Mississippi. It's only about 100 miles from Jackson, where Eudora Welty was born. It's also not that far from Oxford, Mississippi, and New Albany, where William Faulkner was born. So this kind of like shared geography, this shared, a shared kind of time period as well, provided the impetus for us to think a little bit about what if we brought them into conversation with each other, and but not in the way that the 10 years older William Faulkner would be an influence on, say, the younger writers, in this case, Richard Wright, born in 1908, and Eudora Welty, born in 1909, but in a kind of more confluential way. So not in an influential way, but as a confluence. And for that, sort of idea of seeing how their writing streams flow together and where the friction points are and what we might say about similarities and differences in perspective. We've chosen the term confluence, which we've taken from Eudora Welty's work, both The End of the Optimist's Daughter, as well as One Writer's Beginning, where she speaks about confluence as a really interesting methodology. So we're not we were hoping that the contributors are not doing comparison per se, but that they would sort of, entertain the notion of a kind of confluence of flowing together. So um, anyways, let's see. So that was basically sort of like how we started thinking about it. Clearly, the writers are very different. Richard Wright is a well-known protest writer, which brings up the question, is there protest embedded in other writers' works as well? Did they know each other personally? And there are some people who can speak to this in this group. Unfortunately, we're missing Suzanne Mars today, the Eudora Welty biographer. But so the question was, who spoke with whom personally, and how do the texts really speak together? Like, how do they speak with each other? And so what I found interesting in looking at the constellation of the three writers is, and that's also what Jay and I wrote in the introduction, is that while Eudora Welty certainly was aware of William Faulkner and William Faulkner was aware of Eudora Welty, well, let's just say I think they were all aware of each other, creating work from and about Mississippi at about the same time. But while there are letter exchanges and actually personal meetings between Welty and Faulkner, when Faulkner invited Eudora Welty actually famously to take a sail on Sardis Lake in his boat. Nobody knows what was spoken in the boat, but um, but so while there are these physical sort of meetings, and while there is letter exchanges between Faulkner and Richard Wright, there is a kind of like a pause actually that opens up a lacune, a kind of like a gap between the white woman writer from Mississippi, Eudora Welty, and the African American writer of where we don't know, are there any, where did that exchange go? Or why was there no exchange, if indeed there was no exchange? And Suzanne Mars, in her contribution to the volume, sort of claimed that there is no known extant exchange between these two, significant writers. So with the question of personal contact and conversation and the way in which the texts speak to each other, their writing speaks to each other, I think we can perhaps go into individual contributions to the volume in the form of an exposition that everybody might offer to their contribution, and then we can have a discussion, a conversation resulting from that, if that's acceptable. So if we wanted to go with what I just sort of said a little bit about the personal connections, I would suggest that we go to Julia Eichelberger first, because she's got this impressive table of life events that overlap or that speak to each other or that show up some sort of really important differences. And so Julia, would you go next, or would you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, thank you, Annette, and thanks for inviting me today. And yeah, my essay does have a lot of tables in it where I was just looking year by year at the authors' lives. So I'm just going to read a little summary of my attempt to summarize the things in the article that I think might be of most interest to folks here who are especially interested in Wright. My essay analyzes works by Faulkner, Welty, and Wright set in the early 20th century, presenting Mississippians who were tightly constrained by their social and cultural landscapes. I propose that we imagine how each writer, occupying a different subject position, would have differently imagined these stories. Before this volume, scholars rarely examined these writers' lives together. So I just collated existing biographical information into a comparative timeline detailing the writer's family history, the jobs they held, their travels, their agents, their rise to literary acclaim, the contrasting circumstances that formed the vantage points from which each writer imagined and interpreted what was possible in 20th century Mississippi. Readers should be aware that the possibilities open to Faulkner, grandson of an influential businessman in white supremacist Mississippi, contrasted with the delimiting factors he never experienced that Wright did: white supremacist violence, systemic disadvantages in education and civil rights and legal protection. Now, Welty scholars like me believe that her fiction challenges rather than reinforces those hierarchies of race and class from which she benefited. She was raised in a nurturing and financially secure household, and she discovered when traveling the state and photographing Southerners of both races in the 1930s, of both Black and white races, that she had been, as she later wrote, sheltered, and that there was more out there that she didn't know, more than she could perceive. But I think we must acknowledge that all writers have limitations. I believe each of these visionary writers failed to see some of the possibilities inherent in the Mississippi landscapes that they created, and we can benefit from trying to see each text through other writers' eyes. So kind of as a thought experiment, for example, the character of Toby, the Black housekeeper in Faulkner's story Rose for Emily. He sticks around in Emily's house for several days after she dies, after having already lingered for decades after Emily's apparent murder of Homer in the upstairs bedroom. This seems an unlikely scenario for Richard Wright to have envisioned, knowing the risks to a Black man found in the same room with any dead white person. Faulkner may have tried to think this through in an early version of the story in which Emily promised Toby he'd inherit her house in return for keeping her secret. But Wright's uncle was murdered by white citizens who apparently coveted his successful business, and I think he'd have been skeptical about whether Toby would ever have been able to take title to that house after Emily was gone. Similarly, Wright's experience, detailed in Ethics of Living Jim Crow, of how police mistreated Black women would have given him a different perspective on the character of Nancy in Faulkner's story, That Evening Sun. Faulkner invites the reader to assume that Nancy's cocaine use and sex work triggered her public beating by a white customer and later by beating by her jailers, but Wright's essay suggests otherwise. Similarly, Wright's story can add to our reading of Welty's story, Livy, in which a Black man owns considerable property in rural Mississippi. Wright's story, Long Black Song, reminds us just how hard it would have been for Welty's character, Solomon, to hold on to his land. Both Faulkner and Wright's version of Welty's story might also have emphasized the possible danger awaiting the young suitor in Welty's story, the zoot suit wearing Cash in Livy. If we're tempted to see him as a character in a fairy tale, carrying Livy away from her lonely life with Solomon, Faulkner and Wright's works both remind us how unsafe Mississippi is for a swaggering young Black man. At the same time, Wright's Long Black Song contains a valuable account of a Black woman's subjectivity, Sarah dreaming of the man she wished she was with instead of her property-owning husband. Sarah's daydream corroborates Welty's vision of Livy imagining herself flying back home to her family, another young, lonely Black woman in comparative security in her home, yet confined, and she is capable of envisioning another reality elsewhere. Wright's works, which lay bare the often fatal cultural scripts of white supremacy, are also instructive for reading Welty's story, Moon Lake, in which a white girl at summer camp falls into a lake, seemingly at a light touch from a Black boy's hand. Wright's lessons in Jim Crow help readers of Welty's story grasp how radical her vision is here as she turns her story away from a lynching narrative. White men are absent, while one of the white girls in the story imagines what she calls the other way to live, forms of life in the Mississippi woods that are not determined by the cultural scripts she is being trained to follow. Welty's character briefly glimpsed these alternate possibilities while staring out from her tent one night, wondering if one could inhabit a different social position, turn into a different race or gender, as she says, to slip into them all, to change. Readers who know the power of these cultural scripts in this time and place also know that Welty's character is not going to undo them, but Welty shows us that even she can briefly glimpse something more than what her society believes is possible. So by reading and teaching these writers alongside each other, we can fill in some of the gaps that the original writer missed and see more possibilities than each writer was able to see alone. Thanks.
Um, talking about different cultural scripts and the limitations of narrative perspective and so on. Who feels that their project connects with this and would like to make the next statement or say something about their projects? We don't have to go in the order of the contributors list in the table of contents, but this idea, how do these different texts expose racism, classism, sexism in the Jim Crow era? I don't know. Who might want to go next?
My contribution is along those lines in terms of the way these three writers are dealing with race and the contemporary controversy of critical race theory. So I could go ahead if that's all right. Right. I'd like to open with a brief comment honoring the contributions of our colleagues, Jerry Ward and John Lowe, and underscoring how much they're both missed. And with that, I'll start by noting that my contribution to the 2002-04 collection, Faulkner, Wright, Welty, originated not just with the 2021 Zoom conference from Oxford, Mississippi, probing the artistic and Mississippi legacies of these three great writers, but with the political uproar in spring 2020 over critical race theory and anti-racist programs in public life and long-term scholarly projects I've been pursuing on all three writers, separately and comparatively, for the past 15 years. I began with a conference paper on Richard Wright's short story collection, Uncle Tom's Children, Jacob Lawrence's migration series, and the long civil rights movement, and shifted focus a few years later to studies of Wright's and Welty's examination of the cultural and racial consequences and injuries inflicted by Jim Crow segregation, the latter of which culminated in an essay titled Parting the Veil, Eudora Welty, Richard Wright, and the Crying Wounds of Jim Crow for Harriet Pollack's pioneering 2013 collection, Eudora Welty, Whiteness and Race. Concurrently, I've continued to build on my examination of race and history in William Faulkner's work, which began with several essays on Faulkner's 1942 collection, Go Down Moses, including most recently a comparative essay on history of the past and entrapment in that collection, and Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. For me, though, the sudden outcry about critical race theory, a term that traced its origins back to law school curricula in the 1970s, made me want to take another look at race, racism, segregation, and trauma evoked in the writing of these three authors, all born and raised in Mississippi, and in the case of Wright and Welty, living in racially segregated neighborhoods under Jim Crow, all determinedly pursuing literary careers in the 20th century, and all confronting one way or another the realities and consequences of racism. Faulkner and Wright even corresponded briefly regarding Wright's publication of Native Son and Black Boy. And while no record apparently exists of Wright and Welty ever meeting or corresponding or commenting on each other's work, Welty undoubtedly was familiar with Wright's best-selling novel and autobiography, as my colleagues Annette Trefzer and Jay Watson, Suzanne Mars, and Julia Eichelberger, among others, have argued in their contribution to this collection. Hence, I set about to immerse myself in the controversy engendered by the term critical race theory and its compatibility or lack thereof with the work of the writers I've been spending so much time with over the years. By 2020, angry debates over the term itself had inspired new state laws restricting discussion of race, racism, gender, and inequalities in public classrooms, and more recently, executive orders against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in education, government, and business. Such restrictions call to mind all too readily the complicated taboos through which African Americans like Richard Wright were forced to navigate under Jim Crow, as Wright himself specified in his 1945 autobiography, Black Boy, ranging from American white women in the Ku Klux Klan to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It is precisely this kind of enforced silence on issues of race and racism, along with the agitated opposition to the very term critical race theory, that has motivated legal scholars like Kimberly Williams Crenshaw and Derek Bell since the 1990s to resort to the lens provided by critical race theory in exposing the systemic nature of white supremacy, the invention and reinvention in American history, law, and institutions, and by indicting the denial and blindness required to maintain racial inequalities. And though this exposure may appear unsettling to white Americans in general, and Donald Trump and his followers in particular, charges of systemic and entrenched racism, along with similar charges of white blindness, denial, and disavowal, have punctuated some of the most daring fiction by Wright, Faulkner, and Welty, whose lives and careers were shaped by the rise and fall by Jim Crow segregation. All three writers were compelled during their careers to confront the politics of visibility and invisibility, defining the color line during its last decades in mid-20th century Mississippi and America for that matter, but nowhere more so than in several texts written during the racial upheavals of the early 1940s and to the 1960s. Wright's 1942 novel manuscript, The Man Who Lived Underground, Faulkner's 1942 short story cycle, Go Down Moses, and Welty's two civil rights stories, Where is the Voice Coming From, and The Demonstrators. What could be seen in that world and what required erasure to maintain a racial hierarchy dating back to slavery, and what stories could be told and what could not. Many of the answers arrived at by Wright, Faulkner, and Welty were hesitant at best and markedly different in degree of intensity, but ultimately these texts exposed in ways that critical race theorists would have instantly recognized and confirmed the slow entrenchment and yet dissolution of an antiquated racial hierarchy, both bolstered and diminished by white blindness and denials. If anything, critical race theorists like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw are echoing the sad conclusions reached by Wright, Welty, and Faulkner decades ago, that the lingering legacy of slavery, the long-term embedding of racial hierarchy in law and institutions, and even the presence of the past remain stubbornly and seemingly immovable. And so what's so telling, I think, about this controversy and looking at these three writers together is that in many ways they anticipated the dark and dispiriting conclusions of critical race theorists like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. And those conclusions, I think, were somewhat dispiriting for me because I started out with different conclusions about their openness to new possibilities. But I think I agree with Richard Wright's most sort of devastating indictment in The Man Who Lived Underground, that there's nothing left of the end but flight, because justice itself will not be achieved. And so that's basically my take, along with close readings of those three texts.
Susan, yes. I mean, critical race theory, and I mean, now we're in the time of DEI,
Yes.
abolishing all of this, and in the second Trump administration, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this now, but I mean, it's when you wrote this, I think this was what, during or after the first Trump administration, and it's even
Yes.
more relevant what you're saying now, it seems to me that
Yeah,
we're
I'm
just
afraid so. Just
that we're rolling back and we're policing things that, that can be said or cannot be said, or that we should talk about or we cannot really talk about, sort of like exactly in this catalog that Richard Wright sort of like cites in The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, what a
yeah,
black man can say and what he cannot really say. And
exactly.
I mean, so I think this sort of policing of discourse, or the this yeah, I mean, well, this might be overstating it, but this policing of discourse and what cannot be said, and um, um, is, I mean, is super relevant, of course, today. And you've also kind of like already pointed out questions about, in addition to what we can or cannot say, what we see and cannot see. And I think that would link very nicely to Ralph's contribution to the volume about how Richard Wright and Eudora Welty, a white woman, a black man in Mississippi, both saw race, and they both saw people during the Depression, what came into view and maybe what remained invisible. Would it be a natural seg, Ralph, if you pick this up from here?
Yeah.
Sure. I've always been fascinated by Eudora Welty's photographs, and I've also had used in my classes Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices,
Ah,
which uses a number of Farm Security Administration photographs where he worked with Arthur Roskam to create that book. And in the first edition of that book, one of the photographs is by Richard Wright himself. And I was always curious about why that was taken out of it later on, and then discovered Richard Wright's own visual practice. Richard Wright really used his photographs as an aid memoir for his work. One of the things that he did was he went in and photographed the Cook County courthouses and jail rooms, and even where there was an electric chair, to create some of the scenes that he used for Native Son. And I often think that 12 Million Black Voices, in a way, is answering Mary Dalton's question, I want to see how your people live. And so Richard Wright is basically answering Mary Dalton's question. But on the opposite side of it, there's Eudora Welty, whose photographic practice and her writing practice were completely separate. You see the influence of the visual in her work, but you never see where those two overlap. But I was interested in what they both saw and the commonalities in their ways of seeing. In particular, thinking about Richard Wright's, the photographs that he chose for 12 Million Black Voices. I began to look through a lot of the correspondence that he had with Arthur Roskam about that, to discern how he made some of the choices that he made, the visual choices that he made. For example, I think there's a photograph that he crops very tightly rather than kind of giving the full image in there, and wondering why he made that particular choice. And then also moving from 12 Million Black Voices into the photographs that he took in Ghana for his book, Black Power. Richard Wright took 1,500 photographs in Ghana. Only a few of them have ever been published. And I began to look at some of those photographs, and I began to see similarities in the way that he took the photographs to the FSA photographs that he chose for 12 Million Black Voices. I also began to realize that in Ghana, he felt a little bit out of place because he was looking at this place that was beginning to remove itself from its colonial affiliation and becoming a free country. Yet, I think in some ways, Richard Wright had kind of the vision of someone who had been colonized. He was looking at these people almost as exotic. And then I looked at a photograph that he took of a tribal chief in Ghana, which reminded me so profoundly of the photograph that Eudora Welty took that's called Woman of the 30s. And it's a straight on photograph. There's the tribal chief's dwelling in the background, whereas the difference is that Eudora Welty always used the physical landscape of Mississippi to almost as a way to is as much the landscape is as much as just as important to the photograph as the person in the photograph. And thinking about what it was that they both saw and how they looked at things differently, and where do those two really intersect? But their visual practices were completely different, and I find this of interest as a writer because I too use photographs as an aid memoir for my work. I always go out with a camera, and I've been working on a book in the Mississippi Delta, and I have probably over 100 photographs of the Mississippi Delta that I've used for that book, and it's helped me begin to think about how to tell that story. Whereas Welty, a lot of those images I think were already in her head. And I think they began to come out in Phoenix Jackson. Is there a direct connection? No. But what she saw through her camera's lens kind of remained a part of her. And it came out on the page. Whereas for Wright, the visual and the verbal were very much intertwined. And I saw that as the connection and also the difference between the two writers. So hope that summarizes things well. Annette?
Okay, here's for some silent clapping. Thank you. Thank you, Ralph. Fascinating. And I know that I have some questions for you, but for later on. In the interest of letting everybody sort of represent their projects first and talk about what they were thinking about when examining the connections between the writers, we should go from and of Mississippi to the post office, which this was not a good transition. But you guys, the post office is conspicuous for its appearance in all three writers' lives, personal experiences and works, certainly. And Kevin and Donnie, I'd be curious if you could tell us a little bit about the importance of the post office to the lives and the work of the three writers as location, as place, as institution, as a way of thinking about connections, possibly. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, absolutely. I will say from the start, we don't say so much in this piece about William Faulkner, but we would be more than happy to talk about the connections that we saw between Wright and Welty and Faulkner in the Q&A. But first, we want to just thank Almas and Alison and Annette and the Richard Wright Society who have invited us to participate in this session today. So I wanted to start with that. So in our chapter of the Faulkner Welty Wright book, we trace the functions and happenings of the Postal South, as Annette just alluded to. We define the Postal South as a space and time concurrent with segregation, delimiting four constitutive realities, namely widespread residential isolation, women's enforced domesticity, modern industrialization, and long-standing racial dividedness. By Postal South, we refer not only to these historical forces, but also to the material presence of post offices, postmasters, postal inspectors, clerks, mail carriers, trains, steamboats, carriages, mailboxes, and postal routes. All the elements that make modern mail delivery possible. Additionally, Postal South denotes the literary reproduction of these realities, as well as the intricate interconnections of history, literature, and infrastructure. So in our chapter, we map out the meaning of the Postal South as it appears and develops in selected texts by Eudora Welty, Alice Walker, Steve Yarborough, Richard Wright, and Lewis Norton, with a brief interlude by William Faulkner. But for the purposes of this discussion, we'll mainly discuss Welty, Walker, and Wright. Okay, so Welty, Walker, and Wright for this discussion. Welty readers commonly encounter the Postal Service in a number of her stories and novels, namely The Ponderheart and Losing Battles. Welty's post office tends to operate as a force against isolation, particularly in the lives of white women. Originally, we discussed how Welty and Walker converge on writing mail delivery as a liberatory agent, as exposure to the wider world. Contact and communication become vital. They become important for women confined to domestic spaces, with little or no opportunity for contact beyond their homes and local communities. Clearly, though, race divides the narratives that these writers create. Despite the considerable interest Welty devotes to Black women's lives in her photography and fiction, she never explicitly portrays them sending or receiving letters or holding forth inside a post office. However, Walker's portrayals of disenfranchised rural Black women and the potentialities of the U.S. Postal Service not only align with Welty's formulations, but also, where necessary, restructure them. Most importantly, both writers present the suppression of women's access to the Postal Service. Right, so veritable agents of obstruction. Lexi in Losing Battles and Albert in The Color Purple rationalize their actions by viewing their captives as undeserving of private correspondence, where Lexi likely tosses Julia Mortimer's letters in a pigsty. Albert bars Celie from the mailbox, burying her sister's letters in a covered trunk containing his own cherished objects. Driven by this distorted masculine pride, Albert dominates his wife so as to suppress his own incipient sense of sexual inadequacy. As Lexi and Albert seek to contain, control, and suppress, they inevitably inflict great suffering on the women they cut off from private correspondence, leaving both Julia and Celie captive to their respective controllers.
Like Welty and Walker, Richard Wright and Lewis Norton look to the post office as an attractive agency of viability, connection, and exchange. Narrating the impact of the post office on their self-formations, both Wright and Norton trace how access to its services decidedly altered the trajectory of their lives. Although written while living outside the geographical boundaries of the postal South, Wright's Black Boy and Norton's Boy with Loaded Gun detail the pivotal role the post office played in expanding their consciousness beyond the conditioning of their Southern experiences. Wright's temporary stint working at the Chicago post office, which he depicts in Black Boy, provided him a financial security he had not previously known and created the potential for cross-racial friendships. Far from the experience of the singular rural postmaster or postmistress depicted in Welty's fiction, the northern urban post office provided Wright a much larger community of workers that defied the anti-intellectualism of his previous employer and even members of his own family. In contrast to their autobiographical writing, Wright's and Norton's fictional depictions of the post office paint a decidedly unromantic portrait of the Postal Service and its possibilities. Following a day in the life of Chicago postal worker Jake Jackson, Wright's novel Law Today depicts an urban landscape inundated with advertising so omnipresent that it intrudes upon Jake's sleep and reaches into his home via the mail. The flyers in Jake's mailbox advertise dubious spiritual mediums promising wealth and charlatans hawking cures for lethargy, impotence, and alcoholism. Wright's implication is clear. In the facilitation of an exploitative capitalist system, the Postal Service loses its interpersonal communicative power, rendering recipients as little more than gullible consumers without legitimate hope of relieving the ills that blight urban life. Routinely beaten, verbally assaulted, and tricked by Jake into having an abortion that results in ongoing medical problems, Jake's wife, Lil, turns to the male-distributed spiritual publication Unity, a magazine devoted to Christian healing, to sustain her in her otherwise insufferable marriage. Unity, the historical news magazine published in Kansas City, Missouri, reached a national audience when postal reform subsidized second-class mail delivery and allowed for the proliferation of advertising typified by the circulars that Jake pulls from his mailbox. If Lil suffers from physical alienation, the men in law today undergo an alienation of labor that highlights what workers lose in the shift from the small rural post office in the South to the large postal hub in the urban North. Not privy to the human dramas that compel the correspondences these mailmen handle only briefly, they become little more than mechanized sorters, fundamentally estranged from the benefits of the communicative process. Unlike the singular postmistresses in Welty's fiction, who become intimately intertwined in the interplay between mail and recipient, the men in Wright's sorting rooms are reduced to interchangeable, unknown entities, revealing how the Postal Service enhances the connection of some only at the expense of others.
Thank you so much, Donnie and Kevin. Silent clapping. We move from an emphasis on location, on this intersectionality of work and place, and the PO is a gendered and racialized sort of space, to an essay that examines less so location and more so the ways in which our authors represent especially the interiority of African American characters. So I think Anne McMaster and Anita deRouen have written about the question, what are the techniques for Faulkner and for Wright to get into the heads and get into the minds and offer a perspective, offer the African American perspective. So what are the narrative techniques and how do they differ for the white writer? How do they differ from Richard Wright?
Before we start, we do want to echo those thanks to the organizers of this. I was just thinking when we started that this is the first time I've gotten to see Anne this whole year. We work together all the time, and it's wonderful to have these projects to work on and have such a wonderful opportunity to hear so many great thoughts and ideas, and I'm just like buzzing right now. But we must talk about Faulkner Wright and the writing of African American consciousness, and so we will get to that now.
And we pulled out like 10 short passages from our article, and it might be incoherent because we pulled them out. So maybe we'll do the numbers, like just say 1, 2, 3. Is that okay?
No, that's fine.
All right. Do you want to be odd or even?
I'll go odd.
All right.
All right. One might expect the main flow of influence to be from Faulkner to Wright, yet we find the more substantial impact to be the other way around.
2. In Light in August 1932, Joe Christmas's consciousness shapes 8 consecutive chapters, more than a third of this novel, before Faulkner abruptly breaks off the reader's access to Christmas's mind. A character whose consciousness has been central drops out of the novel when he becomes to be regarded as Black by himself and others. This fact invites comparison with Native Son.
3. In Native Son, in the last third of the novel, when Bigger is incarcerated, Wright plunges the reader deeper and deeper into Bigger's mind until the movement of his thoughts becomes the main action of the novel.
4. Unlike Bigger's inner journey, Christmas's is cut off abruptly and prematurely. After Christmas drops out of the novel, his perspective is replaced by that of others, especially that of the disgraced minister Gail Hightower, a white character. Also Byron Bunch, another white character. As long as Christmas's consciousness is central, Faulkner represents it on several levels of thought. Christmas is granted a layered interiority, but Hightower is given the novel's epiphanies. How do we move down?
Oh,
Wait. Yeah.
5. I got all the short ones.
I know
No,
you
it's
did.
okay.
I didn't.
It's fine.
It just happened that way.
In Native Son, both Christmas's experiences of injustice and Hightower's epiphanies belong to Bigger Thomas.
6. In reading Native Son, Faulkner would have taken note of Wright's sustained rendering of Bigger's inner journey after his arrest and incarceration. And Wright's treatment of Bigger's interiority may have played a part in Faulkner's endowing Black characters with interiority after 1940.
7. When Faulkner was revising the stories about Louis Beauchamp after 1940, he may well have been influenced by Wright's treatment of African-American consciousness in Native Son. Arguably, Wright's fiction played a role in the changes that Faulkner made to Lucas from magazine story to Go Down Moses in 1942 to Intruder in the Dust in 1948.
8. Faulkner's treatment of Ryder in the story Pantaloon in Black shows his developing awareness after 1940 of the limits of his ability to represent Black interiority.
9. In Intruder in 1948, Lucas's legal situation now resembles those of Joe Christmas and Bigger Thomas, a Black man who was accused of murdering a white person. And Lucas's attorney, Gavin Stevens, in his lack of understanding of his client's point of view, resembles Bigger's attorney, Max, in Native Son. Wright represents Max as blind.
Metaphorically blind.
Yeah.
10. This is our last one. All right. Even without interiority, Lucas in Intruder in the Dust can be seen as an advance in Faulkner's ability to represent Black characters and issues of racial justice. And this advance is attributable to what Faulkner learned from reading Wright's fiction.
So just to kind of to sum up, the main thesis of our argument is that instead of thinking about it, I think the word confluence is probably a better word to describe this than influence, perhaps, is that Faulkner runs into a moment where he cannot inhabit a Black mind. And we see that kind of realization happening with Joe Christmas and that interiority. And while he does do some more work with this with Lucas, it's not as successful.
There are limits.
Yeah, there's only so much that he can do. And so that realization, at least that the inability to, or the decision to not try to render further understanding of that consciousness, I think is something that gives us a clear sense of the limitations that perhaps a person's identity position, right, can have on what they're capable of understanding, or points to the work that needs to be done in order to sit in that space. If you're going to take a standpoint, it's hard to do that, right, without the empathy or without the work that goes into really trying to inhabit and understand that role.
And this
Yeah.
leaves so much out.
Yes.
We probably already used up our 5 minutes, but I just wanted to say one of the things that was interesting to us as we were working on this article was to look at Faulkner and Wright's financial situations in like 1938 and the early 40s, because Faulkner was hitting bottom financially in 1938, 1940, and Richard Wright, Richard Wright was selling like, Native Son, and then 5 years later, Black Boy were huge bestsellers. They broke all the records. So, and Faulkner was reading about this, and in the U.S. Senate, Bilbo was making speeches against Black Boy that were picked up in all the papers. And so like Faulkner had to become aware of Wright's fiction in these years. And we feel that that influenced Faulkner's fiction and not the other way around. Or maybe we're not talking about influence, only confluence. Yeah. Anyway, I think our 5 minutes are up.
Thank you so much, Anne and Anita. This presentation has brought us almost full circle back to the beginning, which was, when Julia sort of positioned the different subject positions and different sort of ways of, of possibly having blind spots in the narratives and so on. Before we move on, I would like to recognize and thank 2 other contributors who are on our screen right now, and they're Rebecca Mark and Harriet Pollack. They're so I didn't want to, just like, I don't know, sweep you under the carpet or something, but I'm glad that you're part of the discussion, though your papers are not centered directly on, especially on Richard Wright. But we're very glad to have you, and we'll be very curious about your questions and about your contributions. So we're sort of done with the official sort of presentation of our individual projects, and we thought we might be able to now kind of branch out and ask questions of individual contributors and have a sort of discussion with people who are joining us and would like to ask questions from the contributors, or we can talk to each other about questions we have about each other's papers. So with what, half an hour left, we're moving into a more open discussion format. And I wanted to see if anybody would like to jump in and ask a question, either directed to a specific contributor or directed to several of them, or just Richard Wright Society, what are your questions? What are your remarks? What would you like to ask?
Hello, Annette. I don't know if you guys can see me.
Yes.
Because I can't see. Anyway, something. All right. So I have a 1 or 2 questions, a very short question, I think, for Donnie and Kevin, which I think is just fascinating. Can you hear me?
Keith, now your voice is really low. It was very strong, but yes.
Can you hear me now?
Barely. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Maybe I can.
There you go. That's good.
Okay. All right. So I have first of all, I thank you all for this, and I'm salivating in terms of getting this book. When it was sent, the announcement was sent. I wasn't even aware that it was coming out, but now that I am, I'm going to buy it for sure. So thank you all for your work. This is for Donnie and Kevin. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about how the postal system worked in the South during the Jim Crow era, and like, were African Americans allowed to go into the post office, or how did they get their mail in terms of that? And also, what seems to me that's very important about the post office and the postal system is the affect that it has on those characters receiving the mail, right? I remember in The Color Purple, Celie is just ecstatic that she's going to get mail from her sister, and then the letdown when Mr. says, nothing came for you today. Right. So could you talk about those 2 things?
Well,
so I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to turn it to you, but I think one of the things that we did not talk about was Steve Yarborough's novel that fictionalizes the first African American postmaster who is in Indianola, Mississippi, named Minnie Cox. So, Donnie, did you want to talk about Minnie?
Sure. So the novel hews pretty closely in many ways to the history of Minnie Cox, and the way in which she suffered threats of violence, and just a general sense of anger and rage at her ability to hold that position. See, for so many African Americans, who were able to attain positions inside of post offices, that became a signal for Black advancement, and it became a threat to white supremacy. And that was particularly powerful, a powerful moment during the post-Reconstruction period. For a Black woman like Minnie Cox to hold that position within a post office meant that she was an agent of change. She was an agent of power for Black voices, Black communication, Black contact across regions from one region to another. And so historically, as the novel depicts, she was run out of that position. Theodore Roosevelt tried very hard to keep her placed, in that post office. But the threats to her family, the threats to her own life made that untenable, right? It just made that completely untenable. But the symbology of her presence in that post office, I think, could not be denied. And it definitely signaled for many white supremacists an attack on white supremacy and the permanency of white supremacy. So that was one thing that we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but I'm glad that we were able to talk about it here. Um, for the recipients of of mail and private correspondence, um, it was obviously a way for Black people who were oftentimes isolated, as well as their white counterparts, isolated from a wider experience with the world. And it meant everything for these individuals. I mean, there are reports, there are studies by historians who have gone back and who have looked at the impact of isolation, the impact of an absence of mail delivery on the psychologies of those people who have been secluded and isolated, the rates of suicide, the rates of incarceration, really, in mental institutions and asylums. Those things spiked for people who were isolated. And then those same studies show us just how powerfully mail delivery changed their lives, changed their psychologies, gave them an opportunity to correspond with the wider world, and how essential that is, how primal that can be for human consciousness, and how those rates of suicide and how those instances of institutionalization went way down, just completely plummeted once those individuals were given the opportunity to receive mail service. And so, many of these Black individuals and other whites were the complete opposite, had the complete opposite attitude about mail delivery. To say someone like, uh, uh, I forget the woman's name in
Emily?
Emily Grierson.
Yeah.
Emily Grierson, who has this privilege and who has this totally different attitude about mail delivery. So you can see the stark difference in their realities. Those people who were isolated, those Black and white individuals who were isolated, but especially those Black individuals. One other thing to note, and I'll stop here, the degree of segregation, the extent to which it continued throughout every aspect of life, from the way in which bodies were segregated after hurricanes, as we see happening in Zora Neale Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, to the way in which mail was prepared and delivered. The mail itself was segregated within the post office. And there was, an attempt made throughout post offices, especially in the South, to keep Black mail and white mail as separate as possible. And to have a black section of the post office for black mail, and then have a white section of the post office for white mail. So it just shows you the absurdity and the extent to which segregation went during that time.
Just to add on, I think the topic is very relevant to what's happening right now, because the Trump administration is planning to privatize postal service, and that's going to cause a lot of people, if he is able to go through it, to be also segregated, especially those in the more rural areas, and mail, not being delivered or showing up late. It's
yeah.
We've come back around.
Right. Yeah. And it reinforces this realization that mail delivery is a game changer in giving people opportunities. I mean, yes, we're not diminishing the impact of the internet or other forces of communication and exchange, but mail delivery has always been a powerful force, and not an equalizing force, but an attempt to equalize situations. And to take that and diminish that, or to put that into jeopardy, well, it shows you, like you're saying, where we are now and how we have come back to this idea of making America great again, and how people define making America great again. So, yeah.
Thank you both, and thank you all for your wonderful collect. I can't wait to get it. I really can. Thank you all.
I wanted to, before letting you off the hook, Johnny and Kevin, I just wanted to say a couple things about reading your essay. That I was thinking about the biographical aspect of a post office for both of these writers. I was thinking about in Julia's essay, she has a chart where she has the years when Wright is working in the post office next to Welty in the university. And I was thinking about the way in which you tell us, Wright finds the post office to be his university as he connects people who are readers. And the Irish Jude who he was reading the same books and shares the same kind of skeptical approach to assumptions. But I was thinking too about the fact that, so when you talk about Welty's characters having a sense of the liberatory post office, I'm thinking about that enormous body of correspondence that Welty produced, that we now have in the archives and pour over, but just the size of it and the idea that she's in her house with her mom, and she is connecting to people all over the world through these letters, obsessively writing letters. That's just such a rich topic. I also wanted to say, I'm thinking, I couldn't help but thinking too, what each one of these writers would think at our moment of thinking about putting the post office in the Commerce Department of the United States government.
Yeah, definitely.
Would be. Would they be different? They'd be slightly different, I think, but in agreement, maybe. Yeah.
I'll let Kevin, if he would like to respond to your first comment. As for the amount of work that Welty produced in her own private correspondences, one of our pieces, if not this one, maybe the other one that we did on the Postal South, that's in the Mississippi Quarterly, we start with a look at how Suzanne Mars and Julia Eichelberger have done so much work in curating these correspondences and showing just how important they were, not just to her own health, her own sense of exposure and contact with the wider world, but also how important this work is, her own private correspondences are to her literature, her literary production, and how there's a nice symmetry there between what she's writing to fellow authors and what she's producing in in her fiction, whether it's novels or short stories, what she's producing in her fiction. So I think that's an incredibly important element to understanding the importance of her own work, her own writing, her own work, her own correspondences with the wider world, and how, because she completely contrasts and contradicts what other authors, other writers like Thoreau, who completely decry and demean the post office and suggest that the post office is entirely useless and mainly just a space for women to continue their gossip. So I mean, that kind of sexist work that he is doing, she completely opposes that in the work that she produces in her own correspondences, but also in her literature.
Yeah,
And so
I just
I would,
wanted to just mention that, but I just wanted to say it was a radical space for women because it was a private space where women could talk about politics and resistance and still can. And we saw all kinds of information being passed through letters in the 19th century about birth control and how to not have babies. And oh my goodness, the post office was just
yeah.
a way. And I was thinking today whether it still serves that or because of that we don't do that so much. But I was thinking about in the civil rights movement, what was the role of the post office in the political resistance?
Yeah, it was pivotal. I mean, it was absolutely a pivotal moment, and it was completely essential. I don't think that the civil rights movement would have been as successful as it was had it not been for the correspondences among the agents, the workers, the civil rights workers who had to stay in contact with each other. We get this especially from Alice Walker, who spent so much time in Mississippi during the civil rights movement in her campaign to get voters registered. And without the post office, that would have been almost entirely impossible. But yeah. Kevin, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I think we've been talking too much. Let other
Yeah,
people
I'm
ask
sorry. Yeah.
questions
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I have one question, but I think Anne and Anita should go first.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Actually, I just had a comment about this conversation about the post office. So thank you very much, Allison. As this conversation is fascinating, thinking about the role that the post office has played. But I'm also very much aware of the fact that the post office does not play the same role today. That role has been largely taken up by these devices that we use to communicate. And I'm thinking specifically of our three current Mississippi stars, Jesmyn Ward, Kiese Lehman, and Natasha Trethewey. And I'm thinking specifically of Kiese and how he uses or how he kind of presents himself and communicates with people online. His work gets out there, pieces of his work get out there, and he's definitely got an online presence where he shares of himself in a variety of ways. And I guess as a scholar, I will be curious to see what happens to that knowledge. I mean, if I'm blessed enough to live long enough to see what is going to happen with that knowledge and what are we losing, right? What access to the interior lives or to the thought processes of our authors today is being lost because the ephemerality of this device, and as we know, the increasing control of it by powers that may not have altruistic motives, what's going to be left behind? What will we actually be able to understand? So I guess I just wanted to put that out there because as we think about our post office, we know that there's a reason why it's easy in a sense to start imagining the post office going away because no one's conducting business through the post office in the way that they used to.
Yeah, I promise this to say a short little. I'll just say this short little thing, and I will shut up for the rest of the time. I promise. I think one of the things that might be lost is privacy. right? Because privacy on the internet is not the same as privacy that you find in a private correspondence from friend to friend or colleague to colleague that you get through the post office. And so I think that's one of the most important things that we might be losing with the replacement of one infrastructure with another. So I'm done.
And yet, postcards were also sent, probably containing some secrets, but they were open. But anyways, I'm gonna try to transition somehow into another topic. Is there another question somebody might have? I mean, the post office.
I have a question, which is kind of a teaching question, but maybe also a question that some of us are grappling with as we think about our own political engagement in the moment. I think one common thread I've heard in all of this, I'm thinking about Susan's quoting of Wright saying, "Nothing left in the end but flight." I tend to think of Wright as a writer who's very critical of progress narratives about the United States. I think to have this conversation at this moment, it's a real moment where, gosh, I mean, just to have lived through like the narratives that were flying around in the Obama era, and then to be where we are now, and to have the common good and rights on the chopping block in all the ways they are is such um, a refutation to a lot of the progress narratives that I think we've really fed ourselves with. I guess I'm asking, like, as scholars, as teachers, as activists, how do you teach students about that? How do you kind of help them hear the echo of the moment, be realistic about the way that, I don't even know kind of the words to put it in, but like, how do we kind of sit with those things in a way that mobilizes rather than I guess gives way to despair or stagnation. I mean, maybe flight is the answer. I'd love to expatriate and probably all of you, maybe some of you too have spouses that are like, I found we could move here. We could, I mean, I know a lot of people actually are working on thinking through what it would be like to try to figure out a different place to live if you live in the United States. But I guess I'm just interested in how some of you are navigating those tensions, either as teachers or as individuals, as scholars, as activists. So that's my question.
Well, I will say I just taught Black Boy last week in my class on Southern rights and activism. We begin with a reading of C. Vann Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Then we read Black Boy to talk about how, there's this, how Jim Crow is lived, and trying to get students to see the overlap between history and memory. And it was very much a challenge to get them to see that, because it's that the history was very real to them. Wright's experience was, they felt it so viscerally that they couldn't quite connect. And it really took them, and we talked about this book over 3 days. It wasn't until the end of that I began to see them seeing the overlap between the two texts. And that was because it is something that the lived experience is so different than the detached historical narrative that so many of them are accustomed to engaging with.
I'd just like to add, I teach as a high school teacher now. I used to be a college, I've done the college route, and now in high school. And currently I'm teaching, in fact, just this past week, I was teaching Natasha Trethewey's Southern History with my my senior students who are taking my course for college credit. And the thing that is constantly, that I'm constantly running into is the lack of cultural cohesion for our students. So the narrative of Black, the narratives that they are growing up with are different from the narratives that we have grown up with. That poem in particular references Gone with the Wind. None of my students, 50 kids, and I teach at an all-Black high school, they didn't know what Gone with the Wind was, which was progress, right? And yet it made it harder to access fully access that poem until I showed them some of it. And they were kind of like, my God, that's 3 hours. That's a love story. That's not, where are the Black people? So as a teacher, I think one of the things that is most challenging for us, or is going to be more and more challenging for us, is finding a way into the narrative that does not, that encourages them to discover those pieces of the cultural conversation that they are not seeing because we're in our little silos, right? I mean, they could tell you everything about what's going on TikTok right now. And some of that stuff is really important, right, culturally. But that shared cultural experience is not there. And that means that their experience of what the narrative is not the same. It's not like one monolithic narrative about whiteness, about racism, about Jim Crow, all of it. And so as educators, I think we really need to be sensitive to that, and to think about what we might have to introduce, not be annoyed by it, but see that as an opportunity to engage them in scholarly work and the kinds of research and questioning that we do and we enjoy, to find out, well, what was that about? Trefzer wrote that poem. It wasn't that long ago, but she's talking from an experience that these kids do not have at all.
All right, while our microphone is still on, let me just say one thing really briefly that may not really relate to that, but I've just been thinking about how Wright is doing so much of his work in the 1930s, so much of his best writing. And the 1930s is this decade when these authoritarian dictators are rising all over the place. And there's this passage in Native Son where Bigger's thinking about the Japanese going into China and Mussolini and other authoritarian leaders. And he's thinking about it would be good if Black people had such a leader like that. It's kind of the sort of same level of ignorance of our students today. I'm thinking that like a way into getting them to see these connections might be partly the parallels between the 1930s and today, that authoritarianism is taking over. All right, that's all I had to say.
No, thank you.
Rebecca has a hand up.
I just wanted to talk about a pedagogical experience following up on what Anita was saying, that I had the extraordinary pleasure of first being introduced to Eudora Welty by Arnold Rampersad, who taught us a course called Eudora Welty and Richard Wright. And we were graduate students, and in those days, we were expected to read everything by Richard Wright and everything by Eudora Welty, and I do mean everything. So my entire understanding of Eudora Welty from day one was through Richard Wright. So it was always surprising to me when we went to the American Literature Association, we had to go either to the Richard Wright panels or to the Eudora Welty panels. But I was just sitting here and thanking him from the depths of my heart for his awareness of Welty's contribution and his incredible depth of understanding that he brought us of Richard Wright. But the discussion, just by juxtaposing the two, like we're doing here with the three writers, it just transformed everything. So just wanted to put that in, that we can give students context by just saying, okay, well, you're just going to put these two things together and see what happens.
Are we waving goodbye, or is this a hand?
No, I don't know how to ask a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Kevin.
Oh, I was just thinking that this isn't pedagogically speaking, but just in the context of flight, I'm wondering if that's not a distinctly male privilege, at least within Wright's fiction. Because I'm thinking about Law Today, and I'm thinking about Lil, who at the end is basically saying, Lord, I wish I was dead. she's completely trapped. She has nowhere to flee, no money to flee with. She's being horrifically abused by her husband. I don't think flight's an option for her. So I don't know. I mean, within the larger context of Wright's work, you know, do we see that holding up, that pattern where flight is a uniquely male privilege?
When you mentioned flight, Kevin, now I'm thinking about the end of The Man Who Lived Underground, where the blimp
Yep.
shows up. But it's also kind of unclear what the blimp is. Like maybe it's aliens coming to save us. I think
Yes.
maybe we can all fly out together. I was just listening to Nikki Giovanni kind of it was a recording of her in an On Being interview from 2016, and she was talking about Mars too, but her vision of life on Mars was so different from what I hear from who. And it was kind of remarkable and kind of refreshing because space is amazing and the idea of transformation is really powerful, but I feel like the version we're getting is about as yucky as it comes. I don't mean to speak in ways that are too coded. I just don't like to say their names if I don't have to. So
Yeah. I wanted to add about this notion of flight that, and I just finished reading The Man from Underground probably about 4 weeks ago. And at the end of the novel, and I can't remember the main character's name, it escapes me, but he dies at the end of that novel.
Yeah.
Right? He's murdered. So yes, he escapes for a while from law enforcement, but the ultimate flight, I guess, is death. And as someone was saying earlier on the panel, they were talking about how Richard Wright is not here for these sort of progressive kinds of narratives that maybe some of these other writers might be, that we might look at these other writers and see their narratives being or having a different sort of take on progress. So I thought that was very interesting about the ending of that novel. And I look at the ending of the novel as apocalyptic. We don't really. He talks about in that essay about his grandmother. Surrealism comes in a lot. And so it's a very, very interesting ending that I'm still grappling with, trying to figure out what Wright is actually doing or saying about the main characters and his demise. But I also have a quick question for Ralph. And I was wondering, Ralph, if you could talk a little bit about why those amazing photographs that Richard Wright took have not been published. Is it because due to the estate, or why is that the case?
Several of them were published in the British edition of Black Power. None of them were reproduced in the American editions. I'm not sure exactly why. This is something I think happens so often is we see the visual and the verbal as being very separate. We don't see how they actually kind of work together. That's something that I think Wright really did believe in and was very much a part of his practice. I think that they didn't see that. And also, I think the images might have felt to an American audience as being, for lack of a better word, kind of thinking about this colonialist ideas being primitive. And I think that's that may have been part of it. That's something I can't really discern from any correspondence or anything. There's nothing about why his American publishers chose not to use those photographs. There's nothing in the archive that points to exactly why. I'm just speaking from my experience in working in publishing and as an editor, there is that disconnect between those two that I think happens a great deal. Interestingly enough, you're beginning to see in a number of books where those two things are coming together. I just read the Black Utopians, and that's something. Photography and art is very much a part of that book because it is talking about the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit, and kind of you've got to get a sense of the space that all this artwork kind of fits in, and you need a sense of the art as well. So I think we're becoming a much more visual culture than perhaps we were in, the 1950s when Black Power came out.
Your paper made me think of the latest collection of photographs by Ralph Ellison that came out a couple of years ago. So I was just, they will publish Ellison's photographs, but these wonderful Richard Wright photographs have not seen the light of day. I just found that really interesting.
Right. I think there's been a great deal of scholarship on the photographs, but there's not, as I said, there's not a lot of correspondence with his publishers about their decision not to use them.
Thank you.
If I could just say one quick little thing about flight again, I was just thinking about this. I think Rebecca was saying in the chat that male privilege, but also economic privilege, those things play a major role in who gets to leave and who gets to fly and who has to stay behind. I would also say that just one generation removed, we have these narratives of flight, especially in African American literature. I'm thinking about Alice Walker, and I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, who make not just, flights beyond the region, but flights, internationally. And so I think that sometimes that context we must not lose sight of that context as well.
I wanted to come back to the photographs, the Ghana photographs in the British edition of Black Power. I mean, I don't know. There is something, I'm just going to put this out now, but there is something really ethnographic, voyeuristic about them a little bit somehow. And I'm not sure how that actually goes, how these images go with a very political sort of narrative in Black Power. So there may be lots of reasons for why they were not included in the American edition. I'm fascinated. I have not seen, I mean, there's so many photographs. I've only seen what is published in the British edition. And so I'd like to see, I don't know, more of the photographs.
I'm really want to explore more. As I was working on this, the bind key was not open. I mean, they were digitizing. They sent me everything that I asked for without any charge. But I would like to look at more of them. But you're right about kind of the ethnographic nature of the photographs. There is, and I think I even comment on that in my chapter, that especially the photograph that he takes of the chief's feet. And there's something that's very strange about that, and also the chief himself with the shot there, which is very as I said, I do feel that he was trying to connect with Africa in a way. I mean, I think that the way that he writes about it in the text is very different than the way that it comes across visually. So I think there may have been a disconnect between those two things. His way of seeing is very much, for lack of a better framing, it's a white Western way of seeing that is at odds with what he's actually writing about what's happening in Ghana at the time.
Yeah, we could talk a lot longer. I'm sorry, there's a question if somebody who's not asked the question yet. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all. I'm a member of the Richard Wright Society, and this has just been absolutely wonderful. Regarding photos and Richard Wright's time in Ghana, it may be worth it if you are in Natchez, Mississippi, to go to the African American Museum there. There is a section on Wright in Ghana. I can't recall all that's there, but I did get a chance to visit that museum and was very surprised to see what even the little bit that they had on Richard Wright while he was in Ghana. So put that on your list.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will. Almas, we're at 3:39. Do we still want to continue the discussion, or do we have to go? I don't want
there's no technical time constraint, but I realize that others may have activities to get off to, and you've already been so generous with your time, all of our participants, both the contributors, as well as the rest of the audience. So I think Ali may have some comments to close us out. But once again, thank you so much to everyone who is here on a Saturday afternoon on behalf of the Richard Wright Society. And I look forward to seeing you at future events or conferences. But remarks from Ali before we end.
This has been so rich. Others have said just, kind of when your brain's just firing in a million directions, and it's so exciting. I felt that way through this whole conversation. Thanks to every one of you for being here, for your contributions, for your work. For all the things you're doing to sustain your students and the people around you, your communities. It feels like a really sweet spot to be in virtually with you. I feel your good energy, and my heart is with you. Yeah. We at the Richard Wright Society have some other exciting events coming up. We have Deborah Mutnick's book coming out in May, her biography of Richard Wright. So we'll be doing an event around that. We have other good events that I should have done more to tease just now, but Almas has the email list from today, so I can, if you're interested, I can add you. I guess put it in the chat if you would not like to be added to the Richard Wright email list if I don't already have you on there. Otherwise, I'll just take the emails from everyone that was with us today and add you to the list so that you'll know what our events are. We have both a panel and a roundtable coming up at the American Literature Association conference in May. And then I think we're actually hoping to do some online events related to those so that people who can't be there in person might be able to be part of those conversations too. So that's all I have in terms of official stuff. So yes, thank you all so much. What a treat to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
Very,
definitely.
very happy to do it.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Great
Thank
to be
you
with
very
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice
Thank
to
you,
see
Almas.
everybody.
Yeah. So good to be together. Okay, well.